The following feature presentation is part of the Skywalking Network.
Hello, welcome to Star Warsologies, the podcast about science and other fields of study seen in Star Wars. I'm one of your hosts, James Floyd. I'm a freelance writer and I write for Star Wars Insider magazine.
And my name is Melissa Miller. I'm a freelance science writer. I've also written for Star Wars Insider magazine. In this episode, Star Warsologies is going to present Los Angeles Comic-Con panel that we put together called Science Advisors in Science Fiction. I chatted with scientists who consult for the MCU, for Disney, and for a lot of other cool projects. And we talked about the importance of getting at least some of the science right, even if it's kind of a losing battle sometimes. Really enjoyed talking with all of them, and I think you will hear some cool stuff about some of your favorite projects. Let's get right into it. All right, thanks everyone for coming to Science Advisors in Science Fiction. I'm really excited for this discussion. I'm your moderator. I'm Melissa Miller. I'm a science writer. I also run the Star Warsologies podcast with my friend James Floyd here, where we talk to scientists about Star Wars. And some of the guests here have been on the show already, and hopefully I'll have the rest of them on at some point. So I'm just going to have everyone go down the line and briefly sort of introduce yourself and then tell us your scientific background and also what projects we might know your work from.
My name's Toby Wareham. I'm a medical advisor for mostly television. I've done a lot of How to Get Away with Murder, The Rookie. I'm currently fully employed with Lone Star 911. I've done Code Black.
I'm Stuart Sumida. I'm a professor of biology at the California State University campus in San Bernardino, or as we call it, Cal State on the way to Vegas. And I'm a paleontologist by research trade. And first film I worked on was Beauty and the Beast, which is probably before most of you were born. And worked on about 60 or 70 films and video games. Since then, the most recent of which was Disney's Strange World.
And I'm Elizabeth Rega. I'm a professor of medical gross anatomy at Western University of Health Sciences. My first film was Lion King. I've worked on about 40 films and video games. The last one was also Strange World. And in case you think this is a coincidence, we also happen to be co-parents and nerds. So, you know.
Full disclosure.
Full disclosure.
Hi, I'm Clifford Johnson. I'm a professor of physics at the University of California, Santa Barbara. I work on things to do with the physics of space and time, and particle physics and things like that. And so a lot of what I work on is to do trying to understand the nature of space and time itself at the quantum level, thinking about things like black holes. And we do even think about things like whether time travel is possible and things like that. So oftentimes when I help on movie and TV projects, it's to do with things to do with time and space and energy and things like that. So you'll know probably things like some of the Avengers movies. What's that? Yeah, there's a thing.
Pretty indie.
And some of the related things like Agent Carter Season 2 and things like that. To touch on things like that. And so I've helped with those and for Ragnarok. Outside of Marvel, Palm Springs, I think, was a recent one that I worked on. And Paper Girls, a really, really great TV adaptation of the graphic novel that sadly no one saw, but it's really quite nice. And upcoming one of Blake Crouch's books that I'm trying to remember, Dark Matter, which is coming to a screen near you soon, so that should be fun. Anyway, that's enough.
All right. My name is Ronald Coleman. I'm a PhD in regenerative medicine. I am currently the principal investigator, or principal scientist at a biotech company in San Diego, where we're working on clinical trials of Parkinson's disease. But I also am a writer. I write comic books and children's science fiction. But the thing I consult for the most is Jonathan Mayberry. He wrote V-Wars and writes the Joe Ledger series of novels, which is a lot of science fiction, military combat stuff. So I'm usually inventing the science of the bad guys is my general job on those. Is like he's like, how would a bad guy make a race-specific bioweapon? I'm like, this is for a book, right? And then we go forward and do it. But so that's what I do. I do a lot of that. But I also work with a bunch of authors, anyone who has weird science that they want worked on, especially biotech.
Right. Cool. All right, well, let's get into maybe a few of the fun examples. Stuart sent me a sizzle reel for himself. I'm not going to show the whole thing, but I grabbed a few screenshots from some favorites. Lots of Disney horses and stuff like that, if you want to talk about how it helps for realism to sort of trickle into even animation.
So one of the things we like to say when we talk about animated character anatomy and construction, because that's what we do. Animation is about movement, and so to understand how something moves, you have to know how it's built, and then biomechanics. So a little bit of physics. And so in animation, the most commonly animated characters are people, cats, dogs, mice, and horses. There's always a horse. Sometimes it's a very minor character, but there's always a horse. And cats and dogs are carnivores, horses are herbivores, so it's a great biological story. And that's actually the first story I ever got to work on in Beauty and the Beast, Horses and Wolves. And so, and the snowball kept rolling from there.
Something else in your scissor reel maybe you can explain is this like child comparison to Stitch?
Yeah, and since this is one of our co-authored publications, I thought I would plunge in here because the figure in the middle is our son Darwin. Because as two scientists, and we met at the University of Chicago, literally over a cadaver. Hello, nice to meet you. And for many of us that are academics and scientists, we're sort of like sloths. You have to dangle a mate in front of us before we're going to be able to respond. But seriously, Darwin and our son Owen, for those of you that get the paleontology joke of that one, because they fought. And they did, provided us with a lot of references. Stuart does animals primarily, I do people and other primates. And what we're trying to encourage our artists and animators to do is be like scientists, which is they are all very good observers. And so this is an opportunity to observe a human when their body proportions are very different, right? We look at little kids and we think of them as being just like us, but they're not. And so you can see here Darwin's proportions are a lot more like Stitch, and Stitch is designed very consciously to make us feel like it's a toddler that needs taken care of, right? And so a lot of this is, we like to say we're not the science police, but we do with animators what we do with our own students, which is encourage them to do their own observations and create their own interpretations.
He's a lot older now.
He's 22 and a senior at UCR, and he would be appalled if he knew he was. Hopefully this isn't being live streamed.
And then the other thing I just loved so much was this evolutionary tree of dragons. So Stuart, maybe you can tell us a little bit about your work on how to train your dragon and why it's important that there be some realism when we're talking dragons.
So dragons. One of the conversations we had when this group all met was like, what are the weirdest questions you ever got, right? And one of the weirdest questions I ever said, well, what do you know about the anatomy of dragons? I was like, nothing. Never dissected one before, but most mythical creatures are built out of parts we already know. And the trick is, how do we sew them together in a convincing manner? But if something's going to fly in the universe in which you supposedly live, that means you have to understand flight physics. So we literally had something called flight school, where all of the animators had to learn what it meant to have an airfoil for a wing and things known as Bernoulli effect, which is what gives lift to airfoils and things like that. So they do very deep dives. And the reason there's an evolutionary tree of dragons is because I first gave this talk in Louisiana where they didn't want us to talk about evolution. So I'm like, I'm going to talk about evolution anyway. And so we just did it with dragons. They thought it was great. And then all the kids went home and told their parents about evolution.
Sneaky, I like it. All right, well, let's circle back a little bit to how everyone on the panel got into science advising. It's not like there's a given career track here for something like this. So, Toby, if you tell us a little bit how it happened for you, and then we'll just go down the line.
It was completely by accident for me. I didn't even know jobs like this existed. I was working in a hospital in the operating room, and the head of our hospital was friends with Sanjay Gupta, who had just written a book called Monday Mornings, and he wanted to make it into a television show for TBS, and he wanted real operating room nurses on camera so that the operations looked real. So he asked his friend, do you have any nurses you can spare for this? And so she booked my schedule around filming that show. And then I met the medical advisor and went, wow, this is really cool. And it pays a lot better than standing over, a person for 8 hours doing surgery. So I was just very lucky. And that medical advisor who I was working for there, even though I was on camera, she got a show, Code Black, shortly after our show wrapped, and asked if I would come on as an advisor for that. And that's how it started, and it was all just very organic. And like I said, the thought never even crossed my mind that television or movies even have advisors for stuff like that, because most of the medicine is not realistic anyway, so I just didn't think somebody was advising them.
Right.
Yeah, right? If you had an advisor, it wouldn't be that way. But what I've learned as being an advisor is you give advice, and then the directors and the writers have their own outcomes that they want to achieve regardless. And I don't take it personally. I get paid the same regardless of what the end product is, because my husband's a physician and a lot of our friends are in medicine. It's kind of hard when my friends say, you're the medical advisor for that? Well, this was, and I said, yeah, I'm an advisor. That's
right.
I don't write the show. It's not my show. I'm just an advisor. So, but yeah, I feel very lucky and very blessed that I stumbled into this, and I encourage people when I meet, that want to do it. I try and help as many people as I can, because it's just a great industry to work in.
How about you, Stuart and Melissa?
I want Beth to go next,
Okay.
because she's got a great follow-up quote for exactly what Toby just said.
Yeah, so I mentioned I met Stuart at the University of Chicago, where the unofficial motto is where fun goes to die. We're a little proud of that, which just goes to show you how committed we are to the assignment. But it is true. I started on Lion King because while Stuart did a variety of other animals, he was less familiar with primates, and my degree meant that I was very familiar with primates. And for those of you that have seen Lion King, Rafiki is a hybrid animal. He is sort of a mandrill baboon hybrid. We talked a little bit about erectile tissue on the face, because those aren't just colors, it's erectile tissue, and because they're baboons, they also have brightly colored scrota. Fun fact, which in fact Disney did cut out later. If you look at the stick, there may be something dangling on the stick, may or may not be. The point is, as you know, there's a lot that goes into this, and I was working with character designer Joe Hadar at the time. And we put together what we thought was a great character design. I went to the American Association of Physical Anthropologists meetings after the film came out, very proud of what had been done. And of course, I met a colleague, and the first thing that he said, and he was a colleague that I really respected because he wrote the anatomy book I taught with. And he looked at me and he says, yeah, Rafiki walked wrong. Right, and it's true. It's true. They didn't ask me about how he walked, and so they gave him a forward crossing mammalian walk and not the backward crossing primate walk. And the point of the matter is sometimes people think you get to be the science police, right? And Clifford, you said that, and our job isn't to squash people's fun or squash their story, but sometimes those things don't make it into the film or they get cut. And to the general audience, it may look like there hasn't been a great deal of care and attention, and in fact there has been. So I wanted to reinforce your story and to say that despite that, it's wonderful because of that opportunity. I got pulled in to do what turned out to be a much more significant project than a hybrid primate, which is race, sex, and gender in 1992, educating animators in one of our more powerful companies. And I think that looking at what happened with Pocahontas and then later with Mulan, I think it had a tremendous effect to train young animators to use their observational skills and not go by what art school taught them. And it has arguably 20, 30 years later made a real difference in how diversity is depicted in animation. So that's kind of full circle.
See, now you can see why I wanted her to follow up. And so you can imagine some of our dinner conversations. We're just this group in general. It's high on the nerd level. I got my start because I had some fortuitous meetings. Fortuitous and serendipitous is often what you hear. A good friend of mine who was in the art and animation department at UCLA when I was in graduate school, we just hung out together. He got tired of artists, so he hung out with scientists at lunch, and I hung out with artists at lunch because I was tired of talking about biology all day. And so his name is Charles Solomon. He's written dozens and dozens of books in the history of film and animation, and we're very good friends. He was the best man at our wedding. And he said, hey, know some guys who want to learn more about how animals move. Would you be willing to talk to them? Like, sure. And that was when we were still in Chicago. It was February. And when someone says, you want to come to LA in February? Absolutely. And the snowball just kept rolling.
Very brief. So the answer is I don't know. Okay. Because you never know with some of these things. The history of my involvement, and even now, is to sort of make a nuisance of myself in the sense that the industry largely doesn't care whether we exist or not. There's no single model of what a science advisor is, and every science advisor you talk to is a different model as well. And so the main thing is to find ways of letting them be aware that you can be useful and you can help them sell more tickets, basically. My interest is, of course, because overall, I have this crazy belief that science is part of our culture and we should all really be able to take part in it, and we should see science everywhere, because why not? We see all the other subjects everywhere in our media and what have you. And science, as you know, some of you know, is not always well represented. It's often feared, and it's very much misunderstood. And so I feel that we can improve our society by just having more examples of it, more fun things you can do with it. People can really see what's going on, but also, very importantly, you see more people doing science on screen and a wider range of people doing science on screen. And you see science can solve problems, and it's not just some thing off in the nerd corner. Now, if you go into anywhere in the industry and say that, they go, that's very nice, but how does that help me make money? So you don't lead with that. So of interest to me, it was just trying to talk about, and I used to do this on a very popular science blog in the early 2000s that I co-founded, where I would just talk about some movie I saw and talk about things about it I liked and things about it I didn't like and what I would have done and what have you. And then also I was getting students, film students at USC, and I had founded a competition where I'd get them to make little films about science, and not documentaries, but just little stories. And the idea being to help filmmakers, or the future filmmakers in the industry, learn what it's like to talk with scientists. So I would force them to work with student scientists, and they'd put stories together, things like that. I also would sometimes look at scripts. They would be required to do a science thing by the Sloan Foundation, and they had to get a scientist to sign off on it, and I would actually read the things and give comments. And so I think some combination of all of that meant that at some point I would just get these calls randomly from people who actually were in the industry because they'd heard one way or another that I could maybe say something useful about the project they were working on. Some of them may have been former students who've now gone off into the industry. Others, sometimes some of the things I had said on the blog got picked up, and someone read it, and so on and so forth. And at some point, you get involved. You don't go in and go, I'm the science police. You go in and you go, hey, I can help. I can help you tell your story better.
Right.
You're asking me about this piece of science. This is fun. I can give you the buzzwords. Or I can tell you more about this stuff, and maybe there's some other piece of science which will do the job even better if you let me know what you're trying to do. And that doesn't always work, but eventually some writers, some producers, some directors did find that useful. And then word would get around. So you'd done a little thing on this thing, and then someone would call and say, hey, I was working with this other producer, and they said, call you. And so eventually it snowballs. But it is completely random. And even now it's completely not well understood what we really do and how we can really help. So the key is just to keep doing what you do out of love and some motivation, and then hope at some point you get the opportunity to tell people that this can actually be useful for their storytelling, which is at the end of the day the bottom line. I also do a bunch of stuff to do with documentary. I appear a lot of stuff I've done on TV as an expert in the documentary. Sometimes that also generated calls. But the key thing is not to set yourself up as the science police.
Yeah.
I'm the science law. It's the same thing. With me, I was on some panels for the Fleet Science Center talking about, because I was in my PhD program at the Scripps Research Institute, and so I'm close, and grad students will do anything if you offer them food. So it's just a level of poverty that, but they would bring me down and say, we'll give you a beer if you sit on this panel for an hour. All right. And I wound up hanging out with Kevin Eastman, who co-created the Ninja Turtles, really good friends now. It's a really weird thing, and Tom Waltz and all these people who are really awesome. And then I wound up on a panel with this guy, Jonathan Mayberry, who writes 4 novels a year. And we were talking about something on this panel about the science of comic book vampires and zombies. And it was the title of the panel, and he was just like, I've got this idea, how do you think this would work? And so I got a thing out to him, and after a few months, we would go to events and he'd be like, hey, this guy, you ask him any question, he'll write you this giant paragraph, just any question you have. It was like a parlor trick. And so now I just get random calls from people who are writing books or texts or emails, and they'll be like, hey, I'm a friend of Jonathan's, that's how it starts, and I'm, trying to write this book about destroying the world or whatever, and I need some help. And so the most fun thing is when I get to be kind of the villain and the science team on the good side. So I'll be like, all right, so this is what you would do as the bad guy. This is how you would engineer this. And if you were the good guy, you would catch this part first. But then not until you did the deeper genomic scan would you actually catch this part. So I think part of what helps me is, as a person who writes stories as well, I can see how the science and the scientific process can fit into the flow of the story. And that makes it a really fun, collaborative thing. But once again, there comes a point when sometimes he wants bioweapons to move at a rate. It's just not how biology works. There's not a limit of physics, right, where things can only replicate so fast. And at a certain point, I'm like, yeah, okay, that can happen in 12 hours. That's fine. I mean, that's probably not how it would actually happen, but it makes a better story. So, also continually showing up when people had questions, whoever they were, I would come up with it. I would give them a good, well-researched answer, and then it's just being willing to be partially ignored. I don't know. There's a thing where I think a lot of scientists are afraid to say things that they don't understand completely. And in this kind of work, you have to be willing to kind of say, hey, it probably wouldn't work, but if it did work, this is how it would work.
Right.
And that's a big part of it.
Right.
It's just especially the stuff that I do, which is real sci-fi, real.
Right. Clifford, I definitely want to make sure we get to MCU stuff. So if you don't mind, I put up a couple of the slides. Agent Carter is still my favorite part of the MCU. So I put up a couple of the slides that you mentioned. I especially like this one, which as a chemist myself, don't eat the science, don't lick the science. So I know you mentioned doing some of the like chalkboards and stuff like that in Agent Carter. So if you can just tell us maybe what, the MCU sort of asks of you when they call about something like this and designing a lab and all that sort of stuff.
Two things I should say, just as preface. First, toward, what was it? Whatever year the Iron Man film came out, 2008, I think. Just a little bit before then, a thing got launched here in LA called the Science and Entertainment Exchange, which people should know about. And it was an attempt to bridge the communication between the people in the entertainment industry and people doing science. And so the story goes now, I think, that if you call the number 1-844-NEED-SCI, and you say you're working on a project and you need a scientist in this area, they have a list of people who volunteered to be called, and they'll try and make a connection. And so one of the smart things Marvel did very early on, because that came around the same time as Marvel was getting set up, is that they availed themselves of that service a lot, to the extent that I think the whole project, the whole Marvel Cinematic Universe project, I think benefited extremely well from them realizing, there's a channel where we can get expertise. So if you look at, not all of the films, but a lot of what, in my opinion, are some of the most successful ones, benefited from all kinds of advice. Famously, you look at Black Panther or something like that, and there's anthropology, there's science, there's all sorts of, there's all kinds of meetings of minds there to give the richness, texture that film had, that came about from advice. I think with that, and a lot of that came through connections they made through the exchange. So at some point I got involved in the exchange. They called to start things off, they called a lot of the people who were known already to be around as scientists involved in this stuff, and since then I got a lot of calls from Marvel through them, so I should mention that. Anyway, a great example is Agent Carter, in which they got in touch and they just wanted me to do buzzwords, which is often what happens in many of these things. And they just wanted, we have this thing and we want some words, but it was a little more. They wanted to go, how does this weird substance work? And for those of you who know season 2 of Agent Carter, you'll know that it starts out with this strange thing that's found, and they try and understand what it is, and so they had some stories as to where that would go. What happened is that I had lunch with the writer's room, and they hadn't written much yet, which is great. I think it's one of the key things that when these things really work, not much has been written. Now you talk with the scientist, and you get ideas about what you can use and then weave into the stories later on, as opposed to, it's all pretty much done, and get a scientist to tell us some buzzwords for the people to say. So it started very early, and so they were saying, well, how does this thing work? And I said, well, I don't know, because this is, the Marvel universe.
Right.
But it reminds me of this real science that's really fun, that we might be able to borrow some ideas from. So then I would sit there over lunch and explain to them the real science that this is, and then what you need to do there if you have a strange subject that's super cold and you can't touch it and it seems to absorb energy and what have you. You can't touch it, how do you contain it? How do you move it around? So we then talked about containment, magnetic confinement of things, the whole things. So what that meant is that eventually they ended up with a bunch of science they hadn't thought of, some cool ideas that they could then weave into later stories, and build, entire episodes came out based on those conversations. Entire characters came because they got inspired by some of the kinds of scientists that we could have on the show to flesh things out. So it's a really great example. And so of course, yes, I was doing things like, this is the equations they would probably have in the board if they're trying to solve this problem. I ended up writing them for nobody, but maybe 5 people in the world know that would recognize this, but there's the equations I wrote them ended up being period appropriate, but then adapted to the sort of Marvel science, what have you. because anyway, that was a fun thing to do. Because normally it's just E equals mc squared on the board, and that's it. Right. But then some of the stuff I was telling them about the science meant that they would go, well, how would you build a machine? What would a machine like that does that look like? So then I would sketch them. This is, if I were building this machine, this is what it would have to do. This is how you would cable it up. This is what it would look like. It wouldn't be this perfect looking thing because no scientist does that for a prototype. It's all messy and there's stuff trailing out. So this is what that would look like. And then, I visited the set at some point and, oh my God, they built my drawing. So that was kind of cool. And, but then just one last thing, the really, for me, one of the most important things to do when I get the opportunity is not just talk about whatever science or science-inspired thing that's going on, but also help them work on the scientists themselves. So the people who are saying the science, doing the science, what have you, who is that? Is it always Tony Stark? Or maybe there are other people who do science too, and maybe we could expand that. So a lot of the things I would tell when I got the opportunity, again, making a nuisance of myself, in any of those Marvel-related meetings, was helping them realize that it would be a much richer story if you make the science like science really is, which is that it's just not one person who's expert in all the science. We get different people with different expertise and different kinds of people, and that can be fun and gives you more opportunity to tell a good story. Right. And in some cases, they did listen. Yeah. I can't draw a golden thread between this conversation and things that happen, but in one case, I talked with the Rousseau brothers about spreading the science around a little bit, and the writers whose name I've forgotten for a minute, at some lovely point later in Infinity War, they go to Shuri because they have she has expertise they don't have. Maybe they were always going to do that, but I like to feel that was a nice example of them spreading the science around and help the story. Sorry to go on.
No, that's fine. I do have the question also about the scene in Thor Ragnarok. I'm curious about at what point they, was this another thing where they're like, we just need some buzzwords? I believe in Thor Ragnarok, this is called the Devil's Anus, the wormhole, if I remember correctly. But rather than having the scene, it is Bruce Banner says it looks like a collapsing neutron star inside an Einstein-Rosen bridge. Does that mean anything?
It does, kind of, sort of. The idea is that wormholes are sort of connections between distant places in space and time, that sort of shortcuts, if you like, but they don't have to be shortcuts. And so we talked a lot about the idea of the Einstein-Rosen bridge, which is arguably the original wormhole, at least on paper, as a solution of Einstein's equations, which may or may not be a thing you could really make. It's a speculative thing. But it's called the Einstein-Rosen bridge. And to give full credit, I think Sean Carroll was the first person to put that into the first Thor movie. Okay. But the idea of these wormholes that I talked a lot with the VFX people and also Taika Waititi was to show that they have different character. You see all the different wormhole entrances, which didn't look anything like I suggested they should, but that's fine. But they're all different, how they look. And so the idea is that they're different because there are astrophysical phenomena on the other side that's spilling through, in some cases, to there. So then there's a longer conversation, which I scribbled, which you see a fragment of in this conversation, where indeed Banner is figuring that out and realizing that in that case, yes, there's some kind of neutron star doing something on the other side. The neutron star idea I put in there because I had this thing which they didn't go with in that film, that we could then use that as an excuse to investigate the origins of Mjolnir, Thor's hammer, which was forged, as you know from earlier Marvel movies, is forged in the heart of a dying star, which is what a neutron star is.
Got it.
And so I had this whole thing that I wrote for them where I was saying, well, if they went through that, which they do, they would come out near Asgard, and there'd be a neutron star, and that would be the neutron star that the Asgardians used to forge their weapons. They decided not to do that. They do visit the neutron star and a different neutron star later in Infinity War. But anyway.
Well, I mean, now that the TVA is a thing, right? That's just a branch, you know, where
right.
they took your story idea or whatever. So
anyway,
that's awesome.
So they're lots of fun. You throw them stuff, and you help them stay self-consistent, which is all you really can do in a universe where people have magic flying hammers.
Right.
And you try to help them stay self-consistent. You give them fun ideas to help them tell their story, and then you sit back and they use maybe 1% if you're really lucky.
Yeah. Well, sort of going off of that, Stuart and Elizabeth, if you want to talk about the importance of being brought in early in the process. I know you said in your career sometimes you start right at the beginning and you're in those writers' rooms, and then sometimes it's like a last-minute fix they want from you. So which way do you prefer, and how does the science benefit long-term?
Well, as you've heard from everybody up here, they may or may not listen. And I'm going to steal one of the best lines. We know we're not making documentaries. We sometimes help on documentaries. But for the entertainment end of things, and it's really funny because my father's a physician, and he always yells at me. And I'm like, I don't work on medical shows. No, I know someone who does. So if you get a call from someone with the same last name, it's my guy. Anyway, so usually it's best to come in early because you can help them with story ideas or help them avoid problems. A horse doesn't run like a dog, so if we don't do that in the first place, we don't have to redo it, which costs time, which costs money, and that's what producers like, because they like to use their money efficiently. And so normally, I would say, it helps a lot. Sometimes it's simple, just to avoid mistakes. Like I was in very early on Life of Pi, and they said, how is, when a zebra falls into a boat and it's going to break its leg, where would it, because it's going to break it, no, it's a horse that's going to break its leg farther down the leg. Things like that, which simply save the visual effects crews a lot of time. Sometimes it's a silly question. Well, there's no flies in the middle of the ocean, so there won't be flies around the dead carcass, unless you're close to land. Oh, right. Other times we get to have a huge impact on a story, and that's when it's very, very exciting. And I actually, that Strange World's a great example. I'll let Beth mention how that works.
Yeah, Stuart and I have both had very similar experiences. I do Strange World, and I have to say, working with director Tom Hall on this was his passion. And if you haven't seen Strange World, I think it's going to be one of those sleeper animation kind of wonders that becomes more popular with time. It is very deeply sciencey. The entire story is predicated on science, and indeed Tom brought in not just me and Stuart, but probably 4 or 5 other scientists at various points to say, okay, we have this world, and I don't want to be a spoiler on it, but it is essentially extremely biological, and our job was to kind of come up with ideas and say, well, here's how you could accomplish X, because truth really is stranger than fiction. If you look at biological diversity and the way that organisms make their way in the world, the reality is far more interesting and far more complicated than sometimes the writers are able to come up with. And that was lovely because we had such great meetings. At the other end of the spectrum, sometimes you're brought into a project where it's like, how do we fix these eyes? And you're like, it's way too late to fix them. Or one of the heartbreaking projects, all of this beautiful photorealistic anatomy and modeling a gorilla, modeling a human, modeling organs. And then you find out, well, look, we already shot the scene with a dude in a gorilla suit. So that accurate gorilla you did, we got to make it less accurate because we can't shoot the. And that's just show business, folks, right? Right? That's what happens. And so those projects are great. I am going to say, back into my personal kind of crusade in the industry, which is making sure that human variation is depicted in a way that is respectful and is a character and not a caricature, because the industry does not necessarily have a very good history. I would say going all the way back to Mulan and working with Ruben Aquino, who is a Filipino-American animator. We had to make Mulan and Shang look like they were actually from China several hundred years ago and not a Barbie doll with slanty eyes painted on. And believe me, that was actually a battle where it was a pitched battle with the producers, because it hinges on the head shapes of people with East Asian extraction. They're fundamentally different than what art schools are teaching. And to his credit, Ruben gave me a rule of thumb. He said, you know that you're Asian if you put a pencil on your nose and it touches both eyeballs. You're like, oh no, that doesn't happen to those of us that are European. No, it doesn't. That's not the normal. European does not equal normal. It equals one of the several thousands of normals across the globe, and I think there has been some progress made on that. And in the end, if you look at those head shapes, we won, right? If you look at Mulan and Shang from the side, they have shapes that are very evocative and accurate to the point of being respectful. That's not being the police. That's actually moving the needle in the industry. Now, please don't blame me for the costumes. They did not ask me about that.
Yeah.
And yes, they look Korean. Yeah. So you win some, you lose some.
Right.
And so I will say, yes, being brought in early is wonderful. Being brought in too late is heartbreaking. Sometimes when you're brought in too early, what you get hits the cutting room floor, or it changes to a new idea. Kingdom of the Sun, beautiful, realistic South American Disney film that became Emperor's New Groove, which is a great film, but not the photorealistic stuff that we started with. Nevertheless, some of it did make it in.
So I won't take too much time, but I will say the other thing that was great about Mulan, not the most recent one, but the animated version, is that it was also not just ethnic diversity, but male-female anatomy. Okay, I've been doing martial arts since I was 8 years old. Women have longer legs than men. Men have long torsos. Women have short torsos, and vice versa. And so, when there were fight scenes, we said she shouldn't punch him. She should kick him.
Ah, there we go.
And they listened.
Nice. Well, we're gonna open up to audience Q&A here in just a minute, but real quickly, I did want to get to those of you who are immortalized sort of in these projects. That Toby, I know you get to be on screen a decent amount, even if it is just the side of your face there in this one episode of Code Black over to the right. But you're in a decent amount of things. Is that right?
Yeah, like I said, when I started on camera. Of course, I was younger then. But now I try and avoid being on camera. And Rob Lowe was the star of that show, Code Black. And so anytime we had to do something big, which was usually they like to crack chess all the time, I would have to dress and stand next to him to help him do whatever medical thing we were doing at the time. And but he is also the star on 911 Lone Star now. So I'm working with him again, but he's a fireman, so I don't really have to do much medicine with him. Thank goodness. But it's just nice like how that all, worked out. And like I said, I avoid the camera now. I don't want to, with all the high definition television and everything. I'm 60 years old. I don't want to see the wrinkles on my face, 74 inches or whatever. So I try not to, but sometimes you have to, depending on what you're doing and what show you're doing it for. Sometimes they want you on screen, just like I said, to stand next to the actor and just hand them instruments or point or, make subtle moves to get them in the right area and stuff like that.
Right. And Clifford, how you came across my radar in the first place was Palm Springs, which is a great time loop movie, where unlike, some other ones, where love is somehow the answer to ending a time loop, science is the answer to ending this time loop. And I was really thrilled to find out that the science advisor in the movie was you, the science advisor on the movie. So if you've got, we can talk about that for a minute. And then Ron, Ron, I know you are also in the books. So.
I have stories about that, but I think I wanted to show you. So I
Jonathan Egger has this team, and they're Rogue Team International, and then there's a scientist in the books, and he has this really great description in his latest book, Team 13, about this one scientist, with a comfortable belly and looks like a learned bear, and I was like, man, that's the nicest thing anyone's ever said about me. I love that, and also there's an Audible original book called The Werewolf 15 Minutes, and it's about a teenage werewolf who goes on TikTok to show, like, he just transforms on TikTok. He's like, oh, that's what I am. And then, so the scientist figures out it's actually just this weird genetic condition he has. And so the werewolf decides to kill the scientist because he's mad at him. And Ray Porter, who's an amazing audiobook reader, does the audiobook. And so there's this whole thing where Ray's screaming, like, Ronald Coleman, I'm going to kill you. I'm going to kill you. And it's like, I was like, oh, Ray, you say such nice things. And I don't know, like, Ray offered, he's like, if you want that as a ringtone, I'll re-record it for you. So, yeah, so it's fun to be in the books, just to get a little taste of that. But,
So yeah, I know we could probably have done a 15-minute panel with any one of our panelists here. So we'll open up for audience questions. We only have a few minutes, but I don't know if no one's got anywhere to be right afterwards. We'll be in the hallway continuing to answer questions until you run out. But yes, why don't you?
Question for all of you, like, is there a film that you've seen that you weren't a part of, but you wish you had been a part of because they did so many things wrong?
Mission Impossible 2.
That's right. He did tell us in our pre-panel that you got him started, it would be all about Mission Impossible 2. What in particular is terribly
red blood cells are nucleated, so like a virus specifically that's trying to attack red blood cells wouldn't have the cellular machinery to take over.
Okay. And
so the whole concept is that they made this special virus that kills red blood cells. And I was sitting with a friend who's a scientist, and we just looked at each other and was like,
it's not that hard to get that right.
Yeah. Like literally any other cell.
Right.
One cell, if this doesn't work. One cell, one job.
Does anyone else have a quick answer to that? Or if not, we'll...
Okay, I'll tell you my favorite film I wish I'd worked on, and that would have been Iron Giant. It's a fantastic film.
I love that.
It's a lovely film, and every time anyone asks us, what's your favorite film that you never worked on?
Okay. Right, yeah, here in the yellow.
I was going to ask, is there any like examples or can you think of anything where you were told, well, if science works this way, or like they just totally changed the laws of physics on you and then asked you to work on that playing field?
All of them. All.
Right. Yeah, when they come to you with a comic book preference, and yeah.
The main point there is for me is that the pitch, if you like, is that I work on the details of how space and time and various aspects of quantum physics work in this universe, and so I can help you when you come up with a universe that is sort of similar but different in multiple ways. I can at least help bring things we've learned about our universe to that universe to help it still feel real when you're watching. You've spent your money on your ticket for 2.5 hours or 7 hours, however long these things are these days, right? And you at least want to not be popping out a movie every now and again going, well, that doesn't work, it just doesn't look right. So there are things we can use from real science to inspire whatever made-up universe people come with, and that's why I never use the word sort of science accuracy, which people like to talk about in the press and what have you. It's not really about the accuracy so much as it is the plausibility, the believability, the self-consistency to tell your story.
Real quick, that reminds me of the first panel I was on was with Kevin Eastman. It was about the science of mutations, and someone asked if a mutagen would cause turtles, if it's possible, they would all mutate the same way. And I said, well, no, because mutations is inherently random, so why they would all be the same? But I said, all of my experiences from mutagens from this universe, so it's possible that, mutagens from Dimension X work differently, and I can't really speak to that, but other than that, they...
Elizabeth, last thought, and then we'll take the rest of the questions out in the hallway. Please stick around and chat with us.
This is something we both like to say. You have to know the black and the white to walk in the gray.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, one of my favorite projects, and Stuart was involved with this as well, was Disney's Dinosaur, right at the very ancient history in computer animation. They tried to make accurate hadrosaurs, and it looked like, I quote, 2 clacking coconuts. So we know that dinosaurs don't have muscles of facial expression. Only mammals have facial expression. But if dinosaurs did have muscles of facial expression, what would they look like? Where would they be positioned? How would they be fastened? So it was fun as a scientist to create something that never would have existed on 2 parts that exist in 2 different blades. And I think that really sums up, I think, what creatively can be so thrilling about what we do is that you are helping others create something which hasn't existed out of parts which we know very intimately and love very intimately. And, you know, thanks for this opportunity to have fun discussing that.
Yeah, but I want to thank all of you for being on the panel and sharing your science advisor experience with us. So we'll be on the hallway continuing to answer your nerdy science questions. Thank you.
That wraps up this episode of Star Wars Ologies. We want to thank our panelists, Ron, Clifford, Elizabeth, Toby, and Stuart. And we want to thank all of you for listening.
If you're looking for links we talked about in this episode or want to follow our panelists on social media, check out our show notes page at skywalkingthroughneverland.com/star-warsologies. And also check out our YouTube channel, where I'll put up some related visuals with this episode in the next few weeks, but there are a lot of other great episodes there as well, including all of our other Comic-Con panels from the past.
If you have an idea for a topic for Star Warsologies or know an expert we should interview, let us know at Star Warsologies on Instagram and Twitter, or at starwarsologies@gmail.com. No topic is off limits, even if Wookiees have their own legend about Bigfoot.
We also have a fan group on Facebook. It's cleverly named the Star Warsologies Podcast Fan Group. So join us and chat with your fellow listeners and ask us some more questions. We can pass them on to our science advisors. And please also rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast on your favorite service and share it with your friends.
We are part of the Skywalking Network, where you can also find a variety of other great shows about Star Wars, Disney, and more. There is the Neverland Clubhouse, Talking Apes, and the flagship show, Skywalking Through Neverland. There's also a YouTube show, Today in Star Wars History. You can find all of these shows and more at skywalkingnetwork.com.
We'll see you next time on Star Warsologies. Comic-Con!
Comic-Con!